Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, February 7th, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about USAID. It's just
Okay,
been all over the news. I
right.
feel like we've always known that our government was up to all of these shenanigans, but now
Yeah,
it's just all come to the forefront.
right.
But there's so much coming out that maybe you can help me kind of just break it down. Like, what exactly are we seeing coming out of this DOGE exposing the USAID? And can you kind of explain how it was working?
Okay, well, the USAID, I think, as it was initially conceived, and in the way that most people, I think, perceived it, including myself until recently, is supposed to be, a foreign aid program, and meaning it funded various projects in foreign nations to aid in their economic development, to lift them out of poverty. Um, but it turns out, and they still do those kind of things, but it turns out they were doing a lot more. And it wasn't so much that they were directly um, meddling in other countries, but they were funding various NGOs and media organizations that were clearly representing the U.S. foreign policy objectives, or we're working to attain those objectives. Let's say that. So, in other words, yeah, just to give an example, um, it turns out that they were funding many different media organizations around the world. We heard these cries of shock and despair from Ukraine. It turns out that 90% of the media outlets there were being funded, and I think generally through USAID, USAid. Uh, but then the next day there were reports. I think it was Reporters Without Borders. It released some reports saying we now have a global crisis because journalists around the world are not going to receive their paychecks anymore. Around the world, it, and this is all a result of the shutdown of at least the freeze. We'll see exactly what comes of it, but the shutdown of USAid. They had been funding these organizations. Then later statistics came out. I think it was 6,200 journalists were being supported, essentially paid by USAid. 707 different media organizations and something like 250, they say, kind of media linked organizations. I think those are often actually, you can say, so-called anti-disinformation or basically censorship organizations, organizations that work to shape the media landscape, but clearly in the favor of Western hegemony. So this is quite extraordinary, and it kind of explains a lot of things. It helps to explain. It doesn't explain it entirely, but it helps to explain why it seems like much of the world, at least the so-called international community, which is really the Western-led community, speaks with one voice.
So you're saying 6,000 around the world. So, I mean, like, are we talking about like what percentage of the world was being affected by sort of U.S. propaganda? And it seems like it wasn't even limited to just, it also seems like we were propagandizing ourselves. It seems like we were funding Politico as well to kind
Yeah,
of promote this, I don't know, not even necessarily U.S. hegemony, but sort of almost progressive idealism.
yeah. Well,
It's,
that's okay. There's a big question mark over that. I'm not sure that we were doing that. I heard that report too. $8.2 million to Politico. Now, first of all, that's a little bit odd. It would be shocking. It would be clearly something, that I don't know if it actually breaks laws, but it certainly breaks the spirit of a foreign aid agency. If it's coming back and funding certain news organizations within the U.S. Um, but after hearing that report of $8.2 million, it later, I think. Uh, Politico. I guess it was one thing I was wondering is strange Politico because that's not particularly progressive, not particularly, identified with the Democratic Party. What would that be all about? And then Politico itself came out and said that that in fact they had only received something like $23,000 for USAid, and that was actually payment for news services. They have this special kind of department, which I think is called um, Politico, and it has a very, very high subscription fee. I think it's $10,000 or more for a year, and they have various government agencies actually subscribe to this news service, and that added up. I don't know how that could be, but that added up apparently to the $8 million figure. So that may not actually have happened. I think we just have to set that aside and let's get some clarity on that before we go down that road. But clearly they were funding, these foreign news organizations, and you're hearing about, we heard like 90% of the news organizations in Ukraine, and then recently it turns out like all six of the kind of dissident out of country news organizations for Belarus were being funded by them. I think you'll find that just throughout especially Eastern Europe, in relation to those countries that are considered, are targets of particular targets of Western hegemony, places like Georgia too. I think you're going to find a very, very large percentage, if not, similar to the 90% that we saw in Ukraine.
Well, I think many people suspected this was going on, but it seems like it surprised me that it wasn't sort of brought to the forefront earlier. You think that these countries would be very invested into exposing this themselves. Like, why wasn't it able to come to the forefront until what it sounds like was Elon Musk with 6 kids, basically? Have you seen the people that he's hired to go through it? It's a 19-year-old boy, like 22, 25. They're all tech, like super genius kids that Elon's brought on himself to just go through the system. And CNN's going crazy. I don't know if you saw the clip yesterday, CNN, because I guess one of the 19-year-old boy, he goes by the online name Big Balls. And that's CNN had to say that on they're like very upset. Like, this kid, Big Balls, is exposing. It was quite, for me, I found it pretty funny to see CNN having a meltdown over this. But it's amazing to me that why wasn't this kind of exposed earlier? How come other countries weren't able to pull this to the light? They have a very vested interest. Obviously, they're fomenting color revolutions in their countries.
Yeah. Well, clearly some countries have. For example, Russia kicked out USAid back in 2012. Belarus did it, I think, sometime after 2020. So there is an awareness that this is going on, and I'm sure it has been discussed. Like, the Georgians must now be aware of it. It's clearly they kind of wised up to what's going on, and they understand that USAID is part of it. It just may be that we're not. Actually, we Americans were just not aware of it. The extent of the meddling and the support.
So how does this affect the reputation of the U.S. globally? What is the impact of this exposure of just the amount of meddling that we've been doing, that we are just, it's a very sneaky fomenting, dissent within other countries to make everybody like the United States, but it's a very bad look, in my opinion. How is this going to...
Yeah, well, I think it's just it won't make a big difference in itself, but it's just like another pebble placed on the balance. It's just like this. We've had a lot of these kind of aha incidents. These moments where the light shines on something that was in the dark previously, and there's a cumulative effect. There just has to be over time, so it's just another, let's say, pebble on the scale, or another straw on the camel's back.
You think it's just a pebble or another straw? It's not a boulder? To me, it seems like this is a big thing, right? I mean, without all this money going to USAID to support the U.S. hegemonic agenda, then it's the U.S. hegemony is dead, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, I guess, just talking about the informational effect, just the knowledge that this has been going on, that's just affecting the perceptions. That's, I think that's part of this incremental process. But you're right, if these funds are cut off long term and they're not restored, I'm sure that the Democrats are going to fight hard to restore the flow of funds to USAID, and maybe they will succeed. It's too early to say, but right now it's looking like it just may never happen. Um, yeah, that is going to have a huge impact. That this is, again, we've spoken many times about the importance of the narrative. And that's what these different organizations were involved in. It was narrative construction. It was obviously not just doing honest investigative reporting. Otherwise, why would USAid be funding them?
Right.
It's clear there were certain kinds of organizations that were funded because they were pushing certain agendas. In other words, they were supporting and extending the narrative. And, that's the machinery of the narrative. And a lot of that machinery breaks down, you have fundamentally weakened the narrative. It's just, it's not like it's going to stop, but it's, especially in these smaller countries, it's going to make a big difference. We're talking about, often maybe $300,000 for that organization. In the U.S., that wouldn't really mean a whole lot. But in a place like,
Africa, for
Bulgaria or
example.
Georgia yeah, it goes a long ways. I mean, we're
Right.
talking about a lot of money. A place where, again, um, most people are making like a couple bucks an hour or something like that. That adds up to a lot of paid foot soldiers for Western hegemony. And we are hearing now, hey, we're not getting paid. And a lot of those people are just going to drift away. You wonder how much of the support for the EU and for NATO and so on was sincere, and how much of it was just sort of mercenary. You know, is if a lot of these people aren't paid, they may just say, "Well, I don't believe in this anymore." They realize that they believed in it because it was good for them personally to believe in it, and we may see a dramatic impact from this.
Right. Well, I mean, even if they turn the funding back on, let's say, the Democrats come back into power after 4 years, and then they try to bring it all back. I don't think they can turn it back on, right? Because it's been exposed. It's just like, the Wizard of Oz. They pulled
Yeah,
the
right.
curtain
The
back.
man
We
behind
saw
the
the
curtain.
guy,
Right.
right, the man behind the curtain pulling all the levers. It's
Right.
nobody knows it. And if you're working for those agencies and you've been exposed, you don't want to be the guy going back there. It's like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
now you're working for this, as a lackey of the
Yeah.
U.S. government,
Right. Right. Well, I think
against the interests of your own country.
right. I think the whole purpose of all this, the way that these color revolutions are carried out, and the way the narrative is shaped, it really depends on this appearance of sort of grassroots organic organizations, right? It's something that's natural. It's just happening. The people are saying this, right? This is just the truth that's just emerging. And then when you show the machinery and people say, wait a second, there's a big so-called, propaganda machine behind this, and it's cranking this out. I thought that this was, I just kind of took it for granted, but now I understand what's happening. It's obviously propaganda directed at me. It's surely a lot of people are going to wake up and see that. And you're right, even if it does start up again, it's just not going to be, it's not going to have the same power. It's not going to have nearly the same effect that it did at one time. I think that's, it's also, we have to say, it's part of a larger trend that, like, a lot of these Eastern European countries, when color revolutions first happened, they were just, the elected governments didn't know what was going on, and they were overwhelmed by them. That happened with the Rose Revolution in Georgia, for example, and what was it, 2002, 2003. But then Georgia, over time, the people in charge, the people that rose to power and into government offices, just they began to understand. They began to see through. They knew what was going on. So when this most recent color revolution was attempted in Georgia, they were ready, and they held their ground, and they knew exactly what they were up against, and they won. At least they won the most recent battle. But this is just part of that trend, and I think with the next battle, the forces of, let's say, sovereignty, as opposed to Western hegemony, are going to be all the more powerful. They're going to be able to stand the ground with even more assurance. They can say, hey, people, you know what's going on. Okay, this is not a real, grassroots revolution. We know what's going on. It's just the puppet master is pulling the strings. You've seen the strings now, so let's not fall for this.
Right. Do other countries do this? I mean, that could be an argument that the U.S. would make. It's like, well, we have to do this to combat the narrative that maybe the Chinese or the Russians are
Right.
doing this a similar type of thing.
Yeah,
Is there any evidence of that?
The thing is they really can't come up with any examples. The accusations are, there's some shady internet organization that's pushing buttons, on the internet somehow, and it's all, when you actually look at it, it tends to disappear or turn into, something entirely trivial. Like we had that accusation, for example, in the Romanian election. That was the justification for actually annulling the election, right? The election results. But when a proper investigation was carried out, what turned out, it wasn't the Russians that were involved in some sort of internet campaign. Even if they were, I don't know, think it would be that big a deal. But it wasn't. It was actually a Romanian group that was trying to play with, thought that they were being too clever at playing 3D chess, and the whole thing backfired on them. I guess you could argue it worked for them because they created the suspicion about the Russians. But, that's what we see. We have the only accusations that we really have are about internet shenanigans, and they just never seem to hold up to scrutiny. Like in the case of Georgia, it was stated again and again that, the Russians are behind this, they're doing this, but nobody could actually point to any flesh and blood Russian that was involved. It was even on the ground. I mean, all the protests, what a third of the people that were arrested were actually from Europe, from Western Europe, and I guess Eastern Europe too. But yeah, there's absolutely no evidence that the Russians or the Chinese are doing. If they did, that it would be major news and it would be probably greatly blown out of proportion, but they don't find anything. They just don't.
Right. So this is really a unique tool of the U.S. government,
Right.
of funding for news agencies to control the narrative around the world, that they've been doing this, and just the double standard, because like you said, if it came out that Russia was doing this, that somehow Russia was funding some type of, anti-American, pro-Russian news agency in the United States or Canada or whatever, it would be, we would go crazy about it. But it just, like when you take the example of Romania, how these accusations of Russian meddling, and then now we just know that the U.S. has been meddling in every single country. There's a stronger accusation of U.S. in election or interference in basically every single country than you can point to Russia or China ever doing anywhere, right?
Right,
Is that
right.
that fair to say?
I think it is. I mean, like if you were just consuming mainstream news here, you would have the sense that the Russians and the Chinese and Iranians are always meddling. It always goes down to these really, I would say, very dubious stories of, internet-based meddling, and you can never actually, find a real Russian or Chinese or, behind it. But they say, well, we think that this, or this organization, this anti-disinformation organization has given this list of all these different websites that are actually working for the Russians. And then if you actually start going down the list, you'll find that a lot of them are just independent websites that are doing independent research, and they're reporting things that happen to be in line with what the Russian government says. But but that's not, that doesn't make them some sort of a mouthpiece of the Russian government. If you come to an independent conclusion, and if that's the reality, that's the reality. So yeah, you would get the sense again, if you're not paying attention, like, oh, the Russians and the Chinese are doing, like every election, cycle, we have that. There's something that's released by the FBI or whatever. We believe there's Russian meddling. Whenever you hold up a magnifying glass to it, there's nothing. There's nothing. And you don't find anything like this. Nobody's claiming that Politico or The Hill or the New York Times or any newspaper in the U.S. is actually secretly funded by the Russians and doing the Russians' bidding. it just doesn't. There was that hysteria about RT, a few months ago, and there was some claim that one, somebody with a YouTube channel, I can't remember her name, but that she was getting funds from like through RT or something, but she wasn't even particularly pro-Russian or anything. But the thing is, like, we just don't even hear about that. Occasionally they'll make these charges, but they don't follow up with them. It just, I think that like the charges are just used as a political tool to shut down certain organizations that are countering the narrative. And yeah, even if you could show that one or two, I think that's people were being funded by the Russians, I don't believe it. But let's say that it is. It's still two against hundreds, actually thousands, hundreds of organizations that are being funded by the U.S. government. And this is just through USAID. There's got to be other other funding sources too. So it's probably even more. We may just be looking at a part of it.
Right. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure Americans, at least, are asking this question. It's like, we're $36 trillion in debt. We pay so much in taxes. It's like, where's it all going? And it's like, well, here's a big part of the answer. It's going to fund all these shady things. It's just crazy to me that it's taken so long to get answers, because I think for so long, everybody's been asking, like, where's all this money going that we're paying for? Why are we running such a large deficit? What's going on? And everybody's, and just the narrative just didn't make sense. It didn't jive with the, just regular everyday Americans. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump won. It's just that what we've been being fed from mainstream media just wasn't true, and people could recognize it. And then you realize that this machine, USAID is part of it, but it spreads throughout the whole globe. And I wonder, do you think Europeans, for example, are waking up for this? Is it just as shocking to them to start to hear this news? And what kind of impact is that going to have in European politics? Because you think about like the Romanian elections, all these accusations of Russian interference, and now we just have this proof that, the U.S. government has been funding all of these, media organizations to shape the narrative, to put their people in power, to maintain the U.S. hegemony. That's what it's all been about. Is that broken through the European consciousness? And they're like, whoa, this is messed up.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any direct evidence about it, but I just speculate that it's certainly, in the case of Western Europe, I don't know if any funding or much funding actually went to Western European media organizations. I guess they feel like those are safely, on their side. It was just,
I heard we were funding BBC, USA.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, it was like 8% of the BBC budget. That's right, but that's something.
But still, yeah,
that is something. Well, that was also known to be a government-funded organization. That's I think somewhat different. But I think where it really matters is in those, let's say, contested territories. Places like Moldova and Georgia and so on, where we feel like we regard those as being at risk. They haven't fully aligned with us, and that's where a lot of the money goes pouring in. And the revelations there have got to have I would think, would greatly strengthen let's say the sovereignist, the truly independent forces, the ones that want to break away from Western hegemony.
But what about places like Slovakia and Romania? Do you think like Fico, that assassination attempt, and he's been saying that there's attempted color revolution, same thing in Serbia.
Yeah.
Is it all these places that we're behind it?
Yeah. Well, I think it just makes it easier for him to say that. Yeah. He says, here's an additional piece of evidence. And now he can probably point to, this organization, that organization, this website, this news. Now we know that these are directly funded. Maybe it wasn't, perhaps he knew that before, but there were a lot of people that just say, he's just saying that, right? But now you just have the information coming from the U.S. itself. I think that's really what changes things. And I think Viktor Orban was saying that too. Now, it was just really easier to speak clearly and forcefully about these things. Before there was always these accusations that, well, you're just making this up. Nobody else says this. The Americans are denying it. Germany and France, they're all. But now you have the U.S. government itself saying it. It makes it much easier to press your point home. And I think that's what people like Viktor Orban and Fico are finding out.
Was this always the purpose of USAID? I mean, was it always kind of a front? I mean, is that why it was created, just like the National Endowment for Democracy? I mean,
Well, I think the National Endowment for Democracy, yeah, was always basically a CIA cutout. I mean, that's what it was about. It was about regime change, and from the beginning. I don't know, I don't know if anybody's actually written this history of USAID, but I suspect, certainly the way that its initial stated purpose had nothing to do with these things. It had nothing to do with funding, Western aligned media organizations throughout the world, or what is it, transgender opera in Venezuela. There's a lot of the goofy stuff that got involved in. Like I mentioned in a previous program, I actually knew somebody who did work for a USAID. You knew him too, right? He went off to Russia and helped with the sawmill, and that's the stuff that it was supposed to do initially. That was the initial the stated purpose. And I don't know if it was corrupted from the beginning. I suspect it was corrupted over time. It's just that people moved in and started to, take advantage of the apparatus that they already had, these, and the presence they had in all these countries, and began to, pursue these more insidious objectives. That, I haven't actually read the history, but I think that that's probably what the process was.
Right. I feel like the United States could have taken a very different road with something like USAID. Like, instead, it's become basically a bribery organization. We buy off people and, to control the narrative, to foment color revolutions. But if you look at something like what China's doing, the Belt and Road Initiative, that could have been something like the USAID did, right? That this is development, actually building infrastructure. And this is a way to really exercise your power and strengthen ties around the world, is that you help out their economies. You're not trying to meddle in their internal politics. You are just facilitating trade. Was there ever why have we never taken that path? To me, it's such a common sense path that this makes sense, instead of going through this clandestine, shady route that we went. Like, why was that decision made? I mean, I guess you don't know.
Yeah, I really don't know why the decision was made, but I think it was short-sighted. Just looking at the various color revolutions, for example, there were some successful ones, like in Georgia, or early on in Ukraine too. There was the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, but the fact is that, looking in the long run, it's not clear that it really was a success, from the Western point of view. Because, yeah, okay, they did win this election, they got their guy in charge, but he was corrupt, and he really wasn't aligned with the interests of his own people. So, like, Yushchenko came into power in Ukraine as a result of the Orange Revolution, but then he was kicked out. And the other guy, Yanukovych, came back in. Yanukovych only finally was driven out by the coup in 2014. But it failed, and it failed in Georgia, and it actually, in a way, it inoculated them. It opened their eyes. And now you can see that there's still a very powerful pro-Western faction, but you have an energized, I'll call it sovereignist faction in Georgia too. It's not that they're pro-Russia, but they're just not interested in becoming a vassal of the EU or of NATO. So, and and that really is a consequence. I think people would be more overall favorably disposed to Western leadership, becoming a part of the the European Union, if we hadn't engaged in that meddling. So that meddling, sometimes it produces temporary successes, but in the long run, yeah, it pisses off people, and it it causes them to reassess their relationship with the West. You see that going on in places like, again, Georgia, and now we can say Romania, which seemed to be safely really in the Western camp before, but because of the really, blatant suppression of democracy in that country, we're seeing a lot of anger. A lot of people who weren't supporters of Georgescu are now rallying to his side because they say, hey, that's the guy who he got the most votes. We're the Romanians. We're supposed to decide this. Why did this happen? Now, of course, it was one of their own judges that did it, but everybody knows that he was, he's doing that in because he sees his duty as maintaining, the Romania's status as a faithful member of the Western Alliance.
Right. How big of an impact do you think this is going to have on people's perception of Ukraine now? Do you think this is going to really change the narrative there? Because like we said, 90% of the media was being funded by USAID, and just this constant demonization of the Russians was coming a lot from, just on social media too. You just see all these DOGE avatars. Everybody's calling me a Russian propagandist and on Putin's payroll for just talking about what's going on in Ukraine. And I'm not seeing so much of it, maybe because they're not getting paid anymore. It's like,
well, it's got to have an effect. I think there's no question about it. I mean, I have never seen propaganda of, that extreme and that massive for any other issue before. It's just like, I was just stunned by the volume of propaganda and also just the total detachment from reality. Most propaganda has like a pretty large, or at least a kernel of truth, right? You take something and you spin it, or you take a situation, you describe part of it, but then you suppress information on another part of it, and then you give it your particular interpretation, and that can be very effective. But they were just creating stories just out of thin air. We had the Ghost of Kiev and Snake Island, and it just went on from there. It's been constant. And then most recently, of course, was the North Korean super warriors that actually gave up and ran away or something at the end. So that went on for 3 months. I just never could believe. I just said, wait a second.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like all of a sudden we just had one news story. It was on for 3 months. These North Koreans coming in and they're getting chewed up by the brave Ukrainians. And all of a sudden they're like, the North Koreans have gone. Yeah. Like, well, can you explain what was going on there?
Right. Well, I think, that I have never seen any evidence that this was true. Nobody has actually prevented it. And the so-called evidence, I think was evidence to the contrary. Like recently there was, they claimed to have 2 North Korean POWs, and they showed their photos. You look at this; those are not North Koreans. Nobody in North Korea looks like that. They were clearly, one of these Siberian ethnic groups. I can't remember the particular ethnic group at the time, but they're not North Koreans. And anybody who spent time along East Asians says, these are not East Asians. But the Ukrainians probably knew so little about what East Asians actually look like that they felt that they could get away with it. And they did to a great extent. Though I'm sure there were a lot of kind of doubts on the part of the Western media organizations that were passing on all this nonsense. But they've learned that they're not supposed to openly question. The most they would do, that they would do was just say, according to such and such organization in Ukraine, this is the truth. So that way they kind of give themselves an out, when the whole thing might be exposed later down the road. Oh, we didn't actually say it. We just said that they said it. But the overall effect was just to pass on the story, and they did that all the way through. And now it's interesting that all of a sudden, at this time, they would declare that the 12,000 North Korean soldiers just up and left. And I think they saw what was on the horizon. They saw that this funding was going to end. There was a new administration that might not be favorable to this story. And they decided, okay, we got a lot of mileage out of this. Let's end this story, and they did. Okay. But I think this should go down in history as one of the most extraordinary media hoaxes. It's just
The frustrating thing is that I think so many people will just still always believe it, that we're fed it for 3 months.
Yeah.
But yeah, the North Koreans were involved in fighting the Ukrainians, and that's one of the reasons that they lost is because we didn't back the Russia was on the back foot, and they had to ask Kim Jong Un for help, and we didn't come to the help of the Ukrainians the way that the North Koreans did.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people who believe that and who will always believe that.
Yeah,
Yeah. They have a trust in mainstream media, and they say, like the New York Times is saying this, of course it has to be true. Now, if anybody's really been paying attention, is that there's a lot of false information that's passed through the New York Times over the years, going back to, of course, the George W. Bush's war on Iraq, but even before that, most certainly before then.
So you think even if there just becomes more and more overwhelming evidence that there will never be an acknowledgement from these institutions, these newspapers, media organizations, they never will.
Yeah, I think they're just hopelessly compromised. They have, like the New York Times, at one time, it was a good source of information. It clearly had biases, and it did tend to suppress certain kinds of information, especially with respect to Israel. They had a very strong pro-Zionist bias. Occasionally you would get some sort of, an article or an opinion piece, at least, that was sympathetic to the Palestinians. And that might even happen now. But, all in all, it was a serious news organization. Every news organization has its biases. And so you have to be aware of that. And that's always been true in, every country that's had an independent media. But at least you could go to different sources and maybe get a balanced view overall. But these journalists were generally serious journalists. They were trained to shoot for some kind of objectivity. True objectivity, I think, is impossible among human beings. We're not God. We never have the eagle's eye view. We're always looking from somewhere. We have a certain perspective, but we should always try to aim for that objectivity. And I think that actually many journalists in the past did, but that really went out the window. And I think especially when during Trump's first term. And it was actually rather openly stated. It's like, now our job is to attack Trump. And it began with the Russiagate hoax and a lot of these things. And ever since, these news organizations have ceased to be, I really don't think they're doing journalism. You may find a few actual journalists on the staff, but most of them are propagandists. They wouldn't call themselves that, but they think of themselves as advocates. We have to raise the alarm about this, but they're all coming from one perspective. That's the media landscape that we have now.
What's so incredible to me, though, is just how they all worked in lockstep to promote this narrative. And then we realized, first of all, we recognized it within the U.S. media, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, whatever. They all were parroting the same thing. We saw it in so many different cases, obviously with Trump, the Russiagate hoax, Biden being sharpest attack. We can go on forever. But then it seems like it's beyond just this, that we were doing this globally to create this narrative globally, this global machine.
Yeah.
That was, it's like the world's largest psyop. And, and now it's being exposed. And I just want some recognition. I just want one of these institutions to say, like, yeah, this was wrong. We were, that we were on the wrong side of history on this. We were compromised. For the integrity of our own newspaper, we are kicking out this. We are not taking any more funding from the U.S. government, and we're not promoting these narratives. Our job is to report the news and be real investigative journalists. We're not propagandists. But that's just not happening.
No, it's not happening, because they are real propagandists, so it's not happening.
But how did it happen that they were able to? Is it just the money that the U.S. government was able to buy off and use their power and influence to buy off all of the mainstream media? And then it seems like it'd be easier to find out which foreign media hasn't been receiving funding from the United States,
right? Yeah, it's, at least in some countries, I think there's no question about it. It's, I don't know if it's quite right to. I think that's partially true. I mean, they were buying certain kinds of opinions. If again, it's just like if you know where your money's coming from, It's just true of think tanks in this country too. It's just that you know not to discuss certain subjects. You know what your master would like to see. I think there's quite a bit of truth to that. We bought for certain kinds of opinions, but I think probably an even more accurate way of looking at it is that we found those groups that were already aligned with us, because most of these countries do have factions that are really very passionately pro-Western. They're typically a minority of the population, but they're there, and then you just fund them. So essentially, you give them there's a group there that's already aligned with you, and you give them a megaphone, and so you make them appear to be much bigger and more powerful than they really are, and they start to shape the media landscape. Yeah, but now that like all of a sudden the like the power was cut off to the amplifiers that they were using, and the megaphones, they're just not functioning anymore. It's just like everybody's looking and say, wait a second, okay.
Right. Yeah. Well, the USAID, I think they had a budget of about $40 billion a year. And like you said, that can go a long ways, especially in poorer countries, developing
Right.
countries. But that also just seems to be just the tip of the iceberg. If we think about what in your opinion is the other sort of giant pillar of narrative control for the United States?
Um, okay, well, you have the governments themselves. I mean, they're engaged in that. I think and they kind of set the guidelines, the tone for everyone else. And so that's something that where Trump is doing a great deal of damage, because, of course, during the Biden years, the Biden administration was working in lockstep with all these governments. They did have, they exercised narrative control. The West spoke with one voice. And now, at least in this early stage of this Trump administration, we have somebody, that's the single most important player is uttering, heresies, saying, going directly against the narrative on a lot of issues, not all of them, not by a long shot, but some very important matters, especially with respect to Russia and so forth. So yeah, that's a big part of it. It's actually just the governments, the state departments of these various countries, and then,
What
well,
about the Pentagon, the military itself? Do you think that's a big part of
well,
also
it's part of it.
propaganda? Or
It clearly is. It's just obviously NATO I and they do clearly kind of see that as part of their mission. They understand that. I think there was a time when they didn't take that very seriously at all. But it's just that over time they begun to understand that soft power, that information is part of the battle space. And there actually have been a lot of papers that have come out from military-oriented think tanks, that have made this argument. So yeah, they do put an effort into it. I think it's dwarfed by, probably the State Department. That's their specialty, and the presidency. But they're part of it. There's no question.
right? Yeah, it seems like Elon Musk is wanting to set his sights on the MIC next in terms of
Uh-huh.
gutting. So I'm going to be
Yeah, well, that's actually a
fascinated to
lot
see.
more money. Okay, it's just like USAID, that's just a drop in the bucket. We're talking about government waste. It's just a drop or a half a drop. It's just nothing compared to, well, the Pentagon. We're looking at well over, when you look at everything, all the programs, it's really well over $1 trillion. But still, that's even dwarfed by the entitlements. We're talking about Medicare and Social Security and some of these other programs, and Trump probably won't even touch these. So in the end, they will, maybe DOGE, DOGE will succeed in cutting out a certain amount of fat, and that's all good. And I think, but I think when you look at the total government budget, I would be surprised if it actually shrinks, because there are these other programs that really account for something like 75-80% of the total budget, and they're probably never going to touch those. I think the more important thing is that what we're seeing is shedding light on what these agencies were actually doing. And I think we're shocked by it, and that is a service, I think, to the public. That's important. If nothing else is achieved, if he's achieved this, he's achieved something very substantial.
Right. Can I get a refund on my taxes? Like, this isn't what I signed up for,
Well,
right? I mean, we
well,
paid
we'll
all
try,
this money.
you
Yeah, it's crazy. The whole thing is insane. I mean, we all knew that this was kind of what was going on, but
Yeah.
it's so nice to see it come to light. And I just hope there's obviously a lot of resistance to it. You can see a lot of people being very shrill and saying
Yeah.
that, oh, you're jeopardizing, people's lives around the world because of USAID, or there's privacy concerns. And it's just,
Yeah.
but it's like,
Yeah.
hey, look at what's being exposed. Don't you want to know what our money's been doing,
Right.
and just how evil this whole
Right.
machine is?
Right. Well, one thing, I found myself thinking is that, some people are saying this is terrible. There's all these wonderful programs that are supported. We're talking about the true, economic development programs. Now, I think that actually it's not so clear that those programs were really helpful. I mean, there are a lot of questions. There are issues of corruption and just of efficiency. Do they really achieve the objectives that they've stated for themselves? But let's actually just accept, just for argument's sake, that those programs are useful, that they're helpful. Now, if you really believed in those programs, as some of these people that are shrieking right now, then you should not have let them get into this other stuff, into regime change operations and, transgender opera in Venezuela and so on. All of that clearly imperiled the kind of the meat and potatoes stuff that maybe you really believed in. But this is something I think we find like throughout the left. They have some of their old. The old left really was about economic progress and economic equality. And you still have some of that, but it's sort of residual. And as we've had this new stuff come in, the regime change stuff, the LGBTQ stuff and so on. And, maybe these new people really believe in it, but the rest of the world doesn't, and much of America doesn't. And by bringing in this stuff, you've actually put at risk all these other programs that were part of the original purpose of your department.
Right. Okay, I'd like to wrap up by talking a little bit more about Gaza and the Middle East.
Okay.
Can you just tell me what your thoughts are about with Trump's comments? It was just such an insane thing he's saying about the U.S. owning Gaza. Have you changed your kind of perception? Is he playing 3D chess here? Is he just improvising going on? I mean, what's your take on what's happening, and what's the global reaction? You can talk a little bit about that. Of course, it's been
I think the global
but
reaction has been universally negative. And I think actually it's been particularly damaging within the Middle East, for countries like Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia and UAE, their governments, I can't know. I've heard this from more than one source, but it's clear, from their conduct over the decades, they don't give a damn about the Palestinians. The governments don't. And I think actually like it's not the crown prince of Saudi Arabia has told foreign leaders this directly. But but their people do care. And so, they have been, developing a cozy relationship with Israel, and they've long had a rather cozy relationship with the United States. But it's something that they kind of try to keep out of sight from their people. Because they understand that it's unpopular, and it appears that actually, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and maybe some other Arab states, we're working on some sort of program to take over and develop Gaza, maybe in concert with other powers. And but it's not something that they wanted to talk about openly. It was something down the road. This is something that they wanted to keep out of sight of their own people. So by speaking all this out loud, and I think Trump gave it his own particular spin. I don't think that anybody really agreed to the U.S. owning Gaza. I don't see how that would happen. But just talking openly about ethnically cleansing Gaza, um, he put these monarchies, these Gulf monarchies, in a very uncomfortable position, and so they're really quite upset about this. Yeah, I think
So
that
do you?
there have been clearly negative diplomatic consequences. Now, within Israel, it's a little bit harder to say, and this is maybe partly what Trump was thinking, that he was trying to, bolster Netanyahu, give him a win. Now, I don't see why U.S. ownership would be something that they would be interested in. They're about Jewish ownership, let's be honest, of Gaza. But perhaps they're just thinking, that's just never going to happen. But if we have, just as long as we have the U.S. backing us fully on ethnic cleansing, that's great. And in the end, it'll be ours. I think maybe they have this thought. Maybe Netanyahu has this thought. So it may have helped him with certain factions within Israel. I think that's all you can say. Now, speaking larger, kind of looking at Trump in general, he's a hard person to figure out sometimes. I would first of all say that he doesn't play 3D chess. I don't know if anybody really can play 3D chess. I think this is always sort of a way of explaining yourself out of, let's say, embarrassing behavior by your favorite candidate. Well, he's playing 3D chess. You just don't get it. Maybe somebody like Erdogan, occasionally, maybe you could say he's playing 3D chess. I think he's that kind of guy. But I don't think Trump plays 3D chess. Trump actually just plays checkers. Sometimes he plays it pretty well, but I think he's pretty direct. He says stuff that's on his mind, and maybe sometimes he'll exaggerate something purposely, or you make a threat that he doesn't really intend to back up. It's just sort of like to pressure the other side. That's about as far as he goes. So yeah, I don't buy the 3D chess argument. I think it was actually very damaging to the U.S. and Israel in the long run. Again, it maybe just bolstered certain factions within Israel, but that's the most you could say for it.
What do you think is the outlook for the Palestinians in the short term, though?
Well, in Gaza, this ceasefire, again, where Netanyahu wants to get out of it. He's actually said and promised certain people that he'll break it. But then it appears that the U.S. wants him to continue with it and to actually go through with the second stage and the third stage of it, or, the main purpose, I think, is to release the hostages. And it must be remembered that within Israel, there are a lot of people that are in favor of that. They want to see the hostages come home. And that's been, one place where Netanyahu has been vulnerable, that he's constantly been attacked on his failure to get the hostages released. And so you do have a lot of Israelis who are just complete Zionists, and who do in the long run want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, but they also want to get the hostages home. And apparently Miriam Edelson is one of these people, according to Max Blumenthal, that she is. She's about as Zionist a person as you can get. This is the widow of Sheldon Adelson. She's clearly in favor of a greater Israel. I think she wants the West Bank to be annexed and eventually Gaza to be annexed, but she wants to get those hostages home. So you do have support. That may be one reason why Trump feels like he can go ahead and continue to pressure Netanyahu on this, because he actually has backing from, these very wealthy and powerful Zionists in the U.S. for that. It's nothing. They're Zionists, and they're not going to stop being Zionists, but they do want those hostages released. And I think you find that within Israeli society too. There are a lot of people who just want the hostages released. Now, I heard just to understand, where Israeli society is right now, I heard about some very shocking results of a poll that was recently conducted in Israel, and it was over 80% of Jewish Israelis think that ethnically cleansing Gaza is justified, either practical terms or moral terms. Only 3% of Jewish Israelis felt that it was immoral. I mean, that is extraordinary.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is what we're looking at. Unfortunately, it's just this, we see the ceasefire and it seems like a glimmer of hope, but when you look at the larger picture, it looks very much like a temporary phenomenon. Yeah, it has given the Palestinians in Gaza a breather, but while things are definitely improving in the short term there in Gaza, they're right at this very moment they're getting even worse in the West Bank, for example.
If you have such an overwhelming majority that supports ethnically cleansing, which is, and if the Palestinians don't want to leave, that means genocide, right? That means you have to, if they're not willing to go, then that means just killing them. Then there is just no solution. This is just going to have to end with what? How is this going to end? I always ask this question.
Yeah.
How is this going to end? Is it just going to mean that will Israel be sanctioned? I mean, like, you just think that just Israel has to go at some point, it just has to collapse. But then you have all these people there that won't leave either. You have the same problem. And then what, are you going to have a massacre of the Israelis now because they are not going to leave? I mean, this is just such a horrific problem.
Right. Yeah, I don't see a happy ending to this, unfortunately. I just don't. I mean, it just seems like, because again, it's just that Israel itself seems to be in the grips of this kind of genocidal frenzy. It's just.
But do you see an ending? It has to end, and I feel like we're coming. I feel like it's culminating towards that end, and that's why it's just so. It's so horrific, but so I can't take my eyes off of it. It's just like we're headed towards the end of this, and it's going to be
I don't know.
awful.
It could go on for longer than there have been moments, let's say in the past year or so, where you thought, okay, maybe we're approaching some sort of climax, and maybe we're going to have an all-out war, for example, between Iran and Israel. And it's clear that Netanyahu still wants this. He's still working for it. And I think he felt like he got really close to getting it under Biden, because Biden had been so weak, and he was mentally weak, and he was clearly also just he was a lame duck, and and I it was clear that he wanted to go for it, but he didn't get it. And now under Trump, again, these are early days, but it seems that Trump really doesn't want to see a war with Iran. I mean, he's done all kinds of terrible things, lifting restrictions and supplying these, 2,000-pound bombs, or at least lifting the restrictions on them, and a lot of the 1,000-pound bombs, and so on and so forth. But, and he's outright said that, we need to ethnically cleanse Gaza. But also there seems to be a consistent message that he is not interested. He does not want to have war with Iran. He's actually said that openly. Like, some people are saying that I want to, just blow Iran to smithereens. I don't. We just want to work out a deal with them. Now, right. I don't think if he wanted to work out a deal with him, he had a deal when he came in 2016 or 2017, and he ripped it up. And I don't think he's going to, I think the Iranians would be crazy to make a new deal with him. He just didn't keep the first deal. So I don't think that's going to happen.
The Ayatollah Khamenei, maybe didn't see it. I think it was just this morning. There's a couple quote statements. One of them was, he said, negotiating with a government like the U.S. government is not wise, intelligent, or honorable. Right. He was just saying that no, we're not doing any type of deal with the United States. We're not negotiating with you guys.
That they would,
Right. So that's off the table, I think. So.
Right. The thing is, that's what I'm worried about. It's just that, okay, in these early days, it's clear that Trump wants to avoid war with Iran, and it looks like Netanyahu is not going to get his wish, over the next several months, maybe over this first year. Iran, seeing this, maybe say, well, this is a chance for us to just, they know that the threat hasn't passed. It's always been there. It's been there for years and years, for decades. And they've been preparing for it. And now that they have this comprehensive agreement with Russia, they can prepare even more. And I would say in the long run, just looking at the trends, I think the U.S. is going down, and that's the main backer for Israel. Israel's reputation on in the world has been greatly damaged, and it's not, and that damage is not going to be repaired. It's been irreparably damaged. Its backing remains strong, as I said, in places like certain Western European countries, but I don't think they can count on that in the long run. Because there is a growing awareness among these European populations of what's going on, and there is a risk that eventually there will be some really hostile governments very hostile to Israel will take power. I don't see it happening in the near future, but I think it's inevitable in the longer run. It just looks bad when you extrapolate out. Things look bad for Israel. And I think Iran will, meanwhile, grow stronger as they become more integrated with the BRICS and, with both China and Russia. They've learned they don't have to be part of the West. They can, and they can really prosper, and they can become militarily stronger. It's already, they're no military pygmies. They're formidable as they are, but they'll become that much stronger. So somewhere down the road, and within Israel, though, you just don't see any sign that this kind of apocalyptic cult, I think, that's taken over. It's not to say everybody there is a religious extremist, not by a long shot, but that poll showed, that there is just, even among the secular population, there's almost a kind of apocalyptic, nihilistic view of things. And I don't think that that's going anywhere or that's become what Israel is and will be for at least another generation. So we do have it looks like an inevitable clash, and maybe somewhere down the road, I don't know when it will happen, maybe towards the end of the Trump term, or maybe even farther in the future. Yeah, maybe sooner. You can never tell with Trump. Honestly, I think we make a mistake to try to penetrate his mind, because I think it's a rather chaotic mind. The guy's not stupid, but he's just sort of chaotic and inconsistent. And he just at some point just may say, bomb them all to hell, and we'll find ourselves with a major war on our hands. So now, that it's a war that Israel could conceivably lose. It's even with total American backing. Or that would very greatly damage Israel. Maybe it wouldn't be a total defeat, but it would just be it would be a mortal wound. We'll see.
You said that Israel's reputation has been irreparably damaged and it's not coming back from it. Do you believe that the United States' reputation has been irreparably damaged by our support of Israel, and also with what's coming out with everything we talked about USAID?
Yeah. No, it has. It's not as bad as Israel itself, but clearly we have suffered a lot of reputational damage. I think that's just clear, that this unqualified support for Israel was always hurt us, but now, we've taken it so far. Now that Israel's been directly engaged in obvious genocide, and we continue to support them, that's hurt us greatly. There's still you'd be surprised. There's just a great deal of inertia, and there are these factions that are pro-Western, and they just don't disappear overnight. It just seems like nothing. They're just pro-Western, and they just go along. They end up changing their own viewpoints just to conform to the Western viewpoints. But I think that puts them, actually weakens them within their own country. So I'll just give you an example. I was surprised by this, but it came from different sources. But both in, let's say, Egypt and Turkey, clearly very, very important countries in these regions, you have the elite class, and both of these countries are very pro-Western. And now in Turkey, Erdogan has managed to, develop a power base, among the common people, so that so he's not simply a reflection of that elite class, which is pro-Western, but he clearly has to take them into consideration. And so that's why I think you see him kind of always playing. It's also his personality, but he's always playing this game. He leans one way and then he leans the other. He's fiery rhetoric directed against Israel, but he lets the gas to, continue to flow. And Is it oil or is it oil? Anyway, it comes from Azerbaijan. And now, in the case of Egypt, the population is very, very supportive of the Palestinians, and actually, like the Muslim Brotherhood has a lot of influence within the population there in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood is really closely allied. Hamas essentially is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Sisi, who took power through a coup, overthrowing a democratically elected member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. His foreign policy objectives are very, very closely aligned with the West, and he's supported by that elite in that country. Now, what I'm just saying is that as the U.S. begins to decline, it's not like these elites, I think, will decline with it. They become, as we learn, more and more about, the ugly side of Western hegemony. People in this country are going to see more clearly what their elites are doing, and I think they're, eventually they'll find their positions untenable. I'm not going to make a prediction when, but I think just looking at the long term throughout the region, a lot of these monarchies, they already understand that their position is really not very secure. And that's one reason, again, they were very upset by the things that Donald Trump said out loud. But I think that insecurity, that precariousness, is just only going to increase over time. And so eventually, some of these countries like Egypt or Jordan will fall. Maybe Turkey will finally, maybe Erdogan himself will start to back up his words with real action, or there will be a new president that does. I don't know. We'll see what happens in Turkey. It actually could go different directions. But I think, especially Egypt and Jordan, the pressures that are coming from beneath are only going to grow over time. And I think eventually that one of those governments will fall. And that will again tip the scale against Israel in the long run. Or maybe in the medium term, maybe just looking, it could happen faster. Things often happen. You get used to it. It seems permanent. And then just one day it's gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
The government is overthrown. It could actually happen any day in a place like Jordan or Egypt, or they may hang on for years. We'll see.
Okay. Just sort of one last question.
Sure.
Who do you think is in the driver's seat in this relationship between Netanyahu and Trump? Because it seemed like it was clear with Biden, Netanyahu
Right.
could just do whatever he wants. But now it feels different. Who's in charge now?
Yeah. Well, I think actually Trump has the advantage, and that's something that we haven't seen like since maybe Eisenhower, like I was saying. Now, we also have to remember, as I've said several times, that Trump is a Zionist. So we're not, he's not actually opposing Zionism. And he's backed by Zionists, again, like Adelson. But in this particular relationship, we're talking about Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu finds himself in a tight space, in a very uncomfortable position that he's not used to. He's usually, been able to just completely disregard what the Americans say, and they just got to deal with it. It was true, like under going all the way back to George W. Bush and through the Obama years, and certainly under Biden. That was. He even bragged about it. I could just say something and it's just done in the U.S. Now it looks like he can't. Now, unfortunately, it's not really a blow to Zionism, but it is a blow to his own personal power. And we'll see. It's just that Trump, I don't think he wants necessarily to get rid of Netanyahu. He's not like Chuck Schumer. Again, a very ardent Zionist who made that speech against Netanyahu and said that he had to go. It's not that Trump really wants Netanyahu to go, but he wants him to, submit to him on these certain issues, like, again, the ceasefire. It looks like that's what Trump wants to do, and that he's supported by Adelson in that, and he looks like he's getting his way. One thing is, I think Netanyahu always found that he had levers that he could pressure points, like against Biden, for example. Biden was being attacked as not sufficiently supportive of Zionism, which is nonsense. I mean, he was just a total Zionist through and through. But he did have this base that he had to deal with in the Democratic Party, that was very upset. So he would at least, make these gestures. He would wring his hands sometimes. And that was all it was. There was nothing substantial. But because Trump is just like a Zionist, that means Netanyahu does not have these pressure points, the same ones that he could, he could take advantage of in the case of Biden. So he finds himself, just in a greatly weakened position vis-a-vis Trump. Now, if Trump actually wants to do something that's truly, against the greater Israel project, I think then you would find all of a sudden Adelson and all these other people would turn on him, and he would have a huge fight on his hands. And then, like previous U.S. presidents, he would have to bow down. I mean, or he would be pressured to bow down. You just never know with Trump. He might put up a bigger fight than they did. But right now, he's Zionist, but he does seem to have the advantage in this interpersonal relationship.
Right. He's a Zionist, but he doesn't seem to be a genocidal Zionist. At least I hope so.
Yeah.
Like with Biden,
Yeah, I don't know. Because at the same time, like one of the presidents, remember that Netanyahu presented to Trump was a gold-plated pager. It was just disgusting.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this
it's
is
just a terrorist that,
right.
Celebrating terrorism.
Right. Blowing the arms off of kids and all kinds of civilians and so forth. And again, just don't forget that Trump lifted the restrictions on the settlers. They're very minor restrictions, and it just helped them, encourage them to go on their rampages. So I don't know. It seems like I think in a way he's sincere when he's talking about, he wants actually the Palestinians to have a happy home somewhere, but he's also not acknowledging the reality. He's going on and saying that, they've suffered all these, they're constantly being killed and bombed and their homes are rubble and it's just terrible as hell there. We'll just find them a nice place. Why is it hell there? It's because your government supplied the bombs, continues to supply them. You've actually accelerated that to some extent, and you're supporting this regime that's killing them directly. Either he's just, there's some sort of cognitive dissonance going on there. He's not really acknowledging the reality, and or he's just engaged in just, he's just obviously lying. He's covering up, purposely covering up for the Israelis and for the American role in it, pretending to have, to be virtuous and compassionate when he knows very well that that's not what we have been.
Right. Okay, Dad. Well, yeah, we're living through some real seismic shifts right now.
Yeah, it's quite
interesting.
Right. No, it's quite an extraordinary phenomenon. Who knows how it's going to end up. I guess we can get into this later, because this is this whole question of what are the chances that Trump really will succeed in this? And I think that would be an interesting discussion, but we'll do that some other day.
Okay. Yeah, we'll save it for next time. All right, Dad. Well, thanks a lot. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.